Out of the windswept frontiers of Anatolia, where the remnants of fallen civilizations still cast long shadows across the hills, a small tribe of nomadic Turks wandered between pasture and battlefield. Their world was one of shifting alliances and constant warfare, where the borders between empires were drawn not in ink but in blood. Byzantium, once the master of these lands, was in slow retreat, its great walls and cities still standing but its strength ebbing with each passing generation. To the east, the Seljuk sultans who had ruled Anatolia with splendor had fractured, leaving behind a patchwork of principalities, each vying for dominance. And into this contested borderland, the Ottomans were born. They were not yet the formidable empire that would one day dominate 3 continents. They were one among many small beyliks, frontier principalities led by warrior chiefs, who commanded loyalty not through bureaucracy or gold, but through charisma, faith, and the promise of plunder. Theirs was a world of ghazis, warriors of the faith, men who carried both the sword of Islam and the hunger of nomads who sought new lands. These ghazis were as much adventurers as they were holy fighters, driven by a mix of religious zeal and the desire for spoils, carving out territories on the shifting frontier between Christendom and Islam. It was in this crucible of faith, conflict, and ambition that Osman, the son of Ertugrul, rose to prominence. Little is certain about Osman's early life, for the chroniclers of his time were more eager to weave legend than to record fact. Yet the legends themselves tell us something vital about how his followers understood him. They tell of a dream, the so-called dream of Osman, in which he saw a great tree spring from his body, its roots spreading across the world, its branches shading empires and its fruit nourishing nations. Whether or not Osman ever dreamed such a vision, it became a powerful symbol of destiny, a sign that his modest beylik was meant to grow into something far greater than its humble beginnings suggested. The dream became a myth, and the myth became a charter for empire. Osman was no king at first. He was a tribal leader commanding a band of mounted warriors hardened by years of raiding. His authority lay in his ability to lead them to victory and reward them with the spoils of war. But unlike many of his peers, Osman's raids were not mere acts of plunder. He began to carve out permanent conquests, seizing fortresses, villages, and towns along the Byzantine frontier. The lands he claimed were not only taken but held, their populations, Greek Christians, Armenians, and others, folded into his domain. Unlike the destructive raiders who left ruin in their wake, Osman's people offered stability, and many subjects, weary of Byzantine neglect, began to see Ottoman rule as preferable. It was a fragile yet significant beginning, for it allowed his beylik to expand not just by conquest, but by loyalty. The Byzantines, weakened by civil strife and distracted by enemies on multiple fronts, struggled to respond effectively. Once the undisputed masters of the Eastern Mediterranean, they now fought for survival in a world that no longer feared them. Osman's warriors began to encircle Byzantine strongholds, cutting them off from reinforcements and slowly tightening their grip. Outposts like Bilecik and Yarhisar fell into Ottoman hands, and with each victory, Osman's reputation grew. Soon, neighboring tribes and Ghazi warriors flocked to his banner, drawn by the promise of conquest and by the sense that Osman carried a destiny beyond the ordinary. The chronicles of later centuries, written under Ottoman sultans who wished to trace their lineage to a noble founder, transformed Osman into a near mythical figure. They described him as just, wise, and divinely guided, a man who united the fierce independence of the nomads with the discipline of a ruler. While much of this is legend, it reflects the truth of his achievement. Osman took a loose band of frontier warriors and gave them purpose, structure, and identity. Where others rose and fell with the shifting winds of fortune, Osman laid the foundations of something enduring. By the time of his death in 1323 or 1324, Osman had transformed his beylik into a rising power. He never lived to see the full flowering of the empire that would bear his name, but he left his son Orhan a realm strong enough to challenge not only the Byzantines, but also rival Turkish principalities. Under Osman, a seed was planted in the rocky soil of Anatolia. Under Orhan, that seed would grow into a tree whose branches reached across continents. And so the story begins, not with the clash of empires, but with the rise of a small frontier principality, born of nomads, sharpened by faith, and destined to change the course of history. The lands of Anatolia had seen countless powers rise and fall, from Hittites to Persians, from Romans to Seljuks, but none could yet know that Osman's heirs would forge an empire that would endure for 6 centuries, shaping the destiny of East and West alike. The dream of Osman was only beginning to unfold, and the world was about to feel the first stirrings of a power that would come to be known as the Ottoman Empire. When Osman passed from the world, leaving behind only the whisper of his dream and the loyalty of his warriors, it fell upon his son to carry the fragile flame forward. Orhan inherited more than land and soldiers. He inherited a destiny. But destiny alone could not hold cities, feed armies, or expand frontiers. It required vision, strategy, and the courage to turn a warrior tribe into a state. Orhan possessed these qualities in abundance, and with him, the Ottoman enterprise entered a new and decisive phase. The frontier was still a harsh place, caught between the fading power of Byzantium and the fractured ambitions of the other Turkish beyliks. Each rival claimed divine favor. Each sought supremacy over Anatolia. Yet it was Orhan who understood that survival depended not only on the sword but also on institutions. He began to transform his father's loose confederation of warriors into a structured polity, balancing nomadic traditions with the demands of governing towns and cities. He struck coinage in his own name, a declaration that the Ottomans were no longer merely raiders but rulers, and that their sovereignty was recognized in both symbol and substance. The first great prize of his reign was Bursa, a city of immense strategic and symbolic value. Nestled at the foot of Mount Uludağ, it controlled the routes between the Anatolian plateau and the shores of the Sea of Marmara. For years it had resisted Ottoman pressure, its Byzantine defenders clinging to their outpost in a land that was slipping from their grasp. Orhan encircled it, patiently cutting it off from aid until the city finally surrendered in 1326. The fall of Bursa marked a turning point. No longer confined to the rural fringes, the Ottomans now possessed an urban capital, a center from which to administer, trade, and project power. Bursa would remain the beating heart of the early Ottoman state, its markets bustling with commerce, its mosques rising to declare a new order in the land. From Bursa, Orhan extended his reach further. Nicaea, once a proud city of emperors and councils, fell to his forces in 1331, its great walls no longer able to shield it from the relentless Ottoman advance. Then came Nicomedia in 1337, another jewel of Byzantium claimed by the rising crescent. With each conquest, the Ottoman presence along the Marmara grew stronger, tightening its grip around Constantinople itself, though the fabled city would not yet fall. But Orhan's genius lay not only in conquest. He established the first standing army, organized not simply as a tribal host, but as a disciplined force. Out of this would grow the famed Janissaries, though their full form would come later. He also encouraged intermarriage and alliances, weaving a fabric of loyalty that extended beyond bloodline or tribe. Even his marriage to Theodora, the daughter of a Byzantine prince, symbolized a new order in which the Ottomans could command loyalty, not only from Turks, but from Greeks, Armenians, and others who found in Ottoman rule stability and opportunity. Yet fate is never content to let one empire rise without testing it against the ruins of another. In 1354, a catastrophe struck Byzantium that would open the gateway to Europe itself. An earthquake shattered the walls of Gallipoli, the fortress that guarded the narrow straits between Asia and Europe. Seizing the moment, Orhan's son Suleiman led Ottoman warriors across the Dardanelles, taking possession of the broken city and establishing the first foothold on European soil. It was a moment that would echo across history. The Ottomans were no longer a power confined to Anatolia. They were now a transcontinental force. The soil of Thrace trembled beneath their advance, and the ancient lands of the Balkans, long contested by empires, would now become the stage for Ottoman ambition. From Gallipoli, the tide rolled swiftly inland. Villages and towns, weary of feudal strife and attracted to the order of the Ottomans, submitted to their rule. The empire grew not only through conquest but also through the steady acceptance of subjects who found in the Ottomans a firm yet often pragmatic hand. Taxes were collected, justice was administered, and faiths, while ranked in hierarchy, were allowed space to endure. In these early decades, the Ottomans revealed a characteristic that would define them: adaptability. They were Turks in origin, Muslims in faith, but their empire was already a mosaic of peoples and traditions. Rather than impose a single rigid identity, they absorbed and transformed, creating a system where Greeks could serve as administrators, Balkan converts as soldiers, Armenians as artisans, and Arabs as scholars. This ability to weave diversity into strength would carry the empire far, giving it resilience where others faltered. As Orhan grew older, the empire he and his father had built was still fragile, but its direction was unmistakable. Byzantium, once the Titan of the East, was now a city-state, its emperor reduced to watching from Constantinople's walls as the Ottoman tide lapped closer. The other Turkish beyliks, once rivals, found themselves overshadowed by Ottoman strength, and the Balkans, fractured among Serbs, Bulgarians, and remnants of Latin crusaders, would soon feel the full weight of Ottoman expansion. When Orhan died in 1362, he left behind more than conquests. He left the beginnings of an empire with roots deep in Anatolia and branches reaching into Europe. His reign marked the transformation of Osman's dream into a tangible reality, a power recognized by friend and foe alike. And yet this was still only the beginning. The true surge of Ottoman might would come with the reign of Murad I, Orhan's son, who would carry the banner of the Crescent deeper into the heart of Europe, setting the stage for battles that would decide the fate of nations. The Ottoman story was no longer that of a frontier tribe. It had become the story of an empire rising, of a force that would soon clash with kings and crusaders, with emperors and sultans alike. From the ashes of Byzantium and the rivalries of Anatolia, the Ottomans had emerged as a power that could no longer be ignored. The tree of Osman was spreading, its branches stretching wider, and the world beyond the Bosphorus was beginning to realize that a new order was taking shape, an order that would endure for centuries. With the death of Orhan, the mantle of leadership passed to his son Murad. He was no mere caretaker of his father's gains. He was a conqueror with a vision sharpened by the realities of a rising empire. The frontier could no longer be the only stage. The Ottomans had to prove themselves not just against fractured beyliks or fading Byzantine garrisons, but against the full might of Europe. And it was Murad who would lead them into that crucible. He moved the capital from Bursa to Edirne, a symbolic and strategic shift. Edirne stood at the gateway of the Balkans, a city of crossroads and rivers, close to the Danube plain and within striking distance of Constantinople. By planting the Ottoman capital there, Murad announced to the world that his empire's gaze was now fixed firmly upon Europe. It was not enough to dominate Anatolia. The Balkans, too, would fall under the shadow of the Crescent. Murad's armies marched through Thrace and Macedonia, pressing into territories long contested by Serbs, Bulgarians, and Greeks. The Ottomans did not sweep across the land like a storm that left only ruin. Instead, they established a rhythm of conquest and incorporation. Villages that submitted were spared, their inhabitants left to till their fields under new masters. Nobles who swore allegiance could retain their lands provided they bent the knee. Resistance, however, was met with the merciless steel of disciplined warriors. This duality, ruthlessness and pragmatism, became a hallmark of Ottoman expansion. By the 1370s, Ottoman banners flew across much of the Balkans. Bulgaria, once a proud medieval kingdom, was reduced to vassalage. Serbian lords, though defiant, began to feel the tightening grip. And yet, the deeper the Ottomans pressed into Europe, the more determined their adversaries became. The Balkans were not a land to be swallowed whole without cost. It was a land of mountains and fortresses, of warrior aristocracies steeped in their own traditions of valor and of a Christianity that saw in the Ottoman advance not merely another invader, but a mortal threat to faith and freedom. The collision was inevitable, and it came at Kosovo in 1389. The plain stretched wide, a stage set for destiny. On one side stood the Ottomans under Murad, their disciplined troops, their horsemen hardened by years of battle, their faith burning with the certainty of victory. On the other side gathered the Serbs and their allies, led by Prince Lazar, men determined to defend their homeland and their faith against the advancing tide. The battle that followed became legend, its echoes carried in songs and epics for centuries. The clash was brutal and desperate, a storm of spears, arrows, and swords under the Balkan sun. The Serbs fought with a ferocity born of desperation, and though the Ottomans pressed hard, victory did not come swiftly. In the chaos, a Serbian knight, Miloš Obilić, is said to have slipped into the Ottoman camp and struck down Murad himself, stabbing the Sultan in the midst of his triumph. Whether the tale is legend or truth, it captured the spirit of the day, a victory purchased at terrible cost. Murad fell, becoming the first Ottoman sultan to die on the battlefield, a martyr in the eyes of his followers. Yet even in death, his mission was fulfilled. For though the Serbs had struck a mighty blow, their forces were shattered. Prince Lazar himself was captured and executed, and the strength of Serbia was broken. The road into the Balkans lay open, and the Ottomans had proven that no Christian league could easily halt their advance. Murad's son Bayezid, soon to be known as Yildirim the Thunderbolt, inherited his father's throne on that bloody field. The transition was swift, for empire could not pause in mourning. Murad had carved the path. It would now be Bayezid's task to stride down it with relentless speed. The Battle of Kosovo became more than a military encounter. It became a symbol. For the Serbs, it was remembered as a tragic yet glorious stand, a sacrifice that defined their national identity for centuries to come. For the Ottomans, it was the seal of legitimacy in Europe, proof that they were destined not merely to raid but to rule. The plain of Kosovo was soaked in blood, but from that soil grew the roots of empire that would stretch far into the Balkans, binding them to the Ottoman realm for generations. The Ottomans had now crossed a threshold. They were no longer just a rising power along the Byzantine frontier. They were a European empire, planted firmly in the heart of the Balkans. The death of Murad did not halt their momentum. It only fueled the legend. The Ghazis whispered that their sultan had become a martyr for the faith, slain by treachery, but his sacrifice was proof of divine favor. His blood, spilled at Kosovo, consecrated the Ottoman mission in Europe. And so the Ottomans pressed onward, now led by Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, whose speed and fury would bring both dazzling victories and perilous confrontations. The story was quickening, the tempo of conquest accelerating, and the world was beginning to take notice that the tree of Osman, once a sapling on the Anatolian frontier, was now casting its shade over kingdoms far from its roots. The blood of Kosovo was scarcely dry when Bayezid inherited the mantle of empire. Where others might have faltered under the weight of such a legacy, Bayezid grasped it with the fury of a tempest. His enemies called him Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for his movements were as swift as lightning across the battlefield. It was a name both feared and admired, for in his reign the Ottomans surged with breathtaking speed, expanding their dominion over lands that had resisted centuries of invaders. Bayezid's first task was to secure the gains of his father. Serbia, broken but not extinguished, was compelled to accept vassalage. The Serbian princess Olivera Despina was given in marriage to Bayezid, sealing bonds of politics and blood. Bulgaria, already under Ottoman pressure, was reduced to obedience, its medieval kingdom now little more than a shadow under the crescent. To the west, the Ottomans pushed into Thessaly and Macedonia, pressing ever closer to the heart of the Balkans. But Bayezid was not content with gradual conquest. He possessed a restless energy, a hunger for decisive victories that would etch his name into history. In 1396, he faced the might of Europe at Nicopolis, where a crusading army of Hungarians, French knights, and their allies marched under the banner of Christendom to expel the Ottomans from Europe once and for all. The Crusaders were confident, their ranks glittering with the pride of Western chivalry. They marched with the memory of Kosovo and the promise of deliverance for the Balkans. The clash at Nicopolis was savage. The Crusader knights charged with reckless valor, shattering the first Ottoman lines, but Bayezid's discipline and cunning turned the tide. His forces lured the enemy deeper, then encircled them, cutting off escape. The knights who had boasted of victory were cut down or captured, their banners trampled into the earth. The fields of Nicopolis became a graveyard for Europe's hopes, and Bayezid stood triumphant, his reputation as an unstoppable force sealed. With Nicopolis, the Ottomans had shattered not only armies, but illusions. Europe understood that the Crescent was no longer a regional threat. It was a power that could stand against the combined might of kings and crusaders. Constantinople itself, the ancient jewel of Byzantium, trembled under siege. Bayezid encircled the city, cutting off its lifelines, determined to bring it into his grasp. Though he did not yet succeed, his tightening noose reminded the world that the city's fall was only a matter of time. Yet while Bayezid thundered across the Balkans, his ambition stretched eastward as well. Anatolia, fractured into rival beyliks since the fall of the Seljuks, became his next target. One by one he subdued them, bringing Turkish principalities under Ottoman rule. His empire now spanned a vast arc, from the Danube to the Euphrates, a domain that seemed destined to eclipse all rivals. But destiny is a fickle companion. Even as Bayezid's star blazed across the sky, another power stirred in the east, one that would burn brighter and more violently. Timur, the warlord of Samarkand, the so-called Scourge of God, was carving an empire across Asia, his armies leaving pyramids of skulls in their wake. His ambition was no less than universal dominion, and when his gaze turned toward Anatolia, two storms collided. The confrontation came at Ankara in 1402, a battle that shook the foundations of the Ottoman dream. Bayezid's forces, vast and proud, met Timur's seasoned legions on the Anatolian plain. The clash was apocalyptic, a storm of horsemen and arrows, of drums and cries that echoed like thunder across the steppe. For hours, the fate of empires hung in the balance, but treachery and exhaustion turned the tide. Some of Bayezid's vassals defected to Timur, and the weight of the enemy broke his lines. The thunderbolt, who had crushed crusaders and humbled kings, was captured. Timur displayed him like a trophy. The mighty sultan, now confined within an iron cage, paraded as proof of the scourge's supremacy. Legends tell of Bayezid's despair, of how the fire that had burned so fiercely in him flickered and died in captivity. Within a year, the conqueror of Nicopolis, the terror of Europe, was gone. The empire he left behind was shattered. The Ottoman dream, which had surged with such momentum, now lay broken into fragments. Bayezid's sons quarreled over the ruins, each claiming the right to rule. Civil war consumed the state, a time remembered as the Ottoman interregnum. For over a decade, brother fought brother, the empire's future hanging by a thread. To many it seemed the Ottomans were finished, another power to rise and fall in the endless cycle of history. And yet, even in the darkness of defeat, the seed planted by Osman did not die. The Ottomans had proven too resilient, their foundations too deep to be erased by a single disaster. Out of the chaos, one of Bayezid's sons would emerge, steadying the faltering state, rebuilding the empire from its ashes, and carrying the crescent forward once more. The tree had been scorched, but it would not be uprooted. The Ottomans would rise again, tempered by fire, and the world would learn that their story was far from over. The thunder of Timur's victory at Ankara left Anatolia in ruins, and the mighty Ottoman realm, which had seemed destined for unbroken triumph, stood on the brink of annihilation. Bayezid's empire fractured like a mirror dropped upon stone. His sons, each unwilling to surrender ambition, tore the realm apart in a fratricidal struggle that history would remember as the interregnum. For 11 long years, the Ottoman banner was carried not by a single hand, but by many, each brother claiming the right to rule, each fighting to carve out a portion of their father's legacy. The Balkans, once bound to the sultans by fear and force, sensed weakness and stirred with rebellion. Serbian lords, Bulgarian nobles, and Byzantine princes sought to throw off their chains. Christian rulers who had once bowed their heads in submission now tested the limits of their new freedom. In Anatolia, the beyliks reasserted themselves, reclaiming lands they had lost, striking against Ottoman garrisons left exposed by the chaos. It seemed to friend and foe alike that the Ottomans were another empire swallowed by the tides of history, destined to be remembered as a fleeting storm that had burned brightly, only to be extinguished in its prime. But the Ottoman story was not so easily ended. Out of the fray, one son rose above the others not by sheer force of arms alone, but by patience, resilience, and the ability to balance ruthlessness with reconciliation. His name was Mehmed, later known as Mehmed Çelebi, and he would become the architect of Ottoman survival. Mehmed fought his brothers with a grim determination, each victory consolidating another fragment of the shattered realm. First, he secured Anatolia, breaking the rivalries of his kin and the ambitions of local beyliks. He restored the line of authority that had nearly vanished, re-establishing Bursa as a seat of power and reviving the machinery of governance that had been left rusting in neglect. His enemies underestimated him, mistaking his caution for weakness, but his steady hand ensured that when he struck decisively. In 1413, after years of bitter struggle, Mehmed emerged as the sole ruler of the Ottoman domains. The interregnum was over. The empire, though scarred and diminished, was united once more. He took the title of Mehmed I, not only as a sultan but as a restorer, a builder who breathed life back into the body of a state many believed dead. Mehmed's reign was not one of dazzling conquests or thunderous victories like those of his father. His was a reign of restoration, of careful rebuilding. He re-established Ottoman control in the Balkans, compelling Serbia and other states to reaffirm their vassalage. He stabilized Anatolia, defeating those who still clung to dreams of independence. He rebuilt the army, restoring its confidence after the humiliation of Ankara. The Ottomans under Mehmed were not yet the overwhelming force they had once seemed, but they were once again a coherent power, one whose survival was itself a triumph. And yet, his reign also revealed the enduring fragility of the empire. In 1416, a rebellion erupted along the Aegean coast, led by Sheikh Bedreddin, a mystic whose teachings of social equality and shared property inspired the poor and dispossessed. His revolt spread like wildfire, drawing peasants, dervishes, and even disillusioned soldiers to his cause. For a moment it seemed as though the Ottoman order might be undone from within, not by foreign conquerors but by its own subjects demanding a different vision of justice. Mehmed acted swiftly and mercilessly, crushing the rebellion and executing Bedreddin. The revolt was extinguished, but it left a scar, a reminder that beneath the empire's surface discontent could smolder, waiting for its chance to ignite. By the time Mehmed III died in 1421, the Ottomans were no longer the shattered remnant he had inherited. They were once again a functioning empire, their authority restored, their armies disciplined, their borders secure. Yet the work was far from complete. His son, Murad II, would inherit not only the throne but also the burden of carrying the empire beyond survival into renewal, of transforming stability into expansion once more. The interregnum had tested the Ottomans in fire. It had revealed their vulnerabilities, exposed the dangers of succession disputes, and humbled their ambitions. But it had also proven their resilience. No storm, not even the wrath of Timur, could uproot the tree of Osman once it had sunk its roots deep into the soil of Anatolia and the Balkans. The empire had survived its first great trial, and survival itself was victory. Now, with Mehmed's steady restoration complete, the stage was set for the Ottomans to rise again, not merely as survivors, but as conquerors who would carry their banners across Europe and into the heart of Christendom. The dream that had faltered at Ankara was alive once more, and in the reign of Murad II, it would begin to blaze with renewed vigor. When Mehmed III passed into the silence of history, his son Murad II inherited the throne of a realm that had been rebuilt, but not yet secure. The scars of the interregnum were still visible, and the Ottomans' enemies, both east and west, still watched for weakness. Murad was young, scarcely in his 20s, when the burden of empire fell upon his shoulders. Youth, however, did not mean timidity. He quickly proved himself a ruler of resolve, one who would defend his inheritance with vigor and test the strength of Europe with renewed ambition. From the moment he ascended, the Sultan was confronted with threats on multiple fronts. In Anatolia, rival beyliks once more tested Ottoman authority, hoping to exploit a young ruler's inexperience. Their armies gathered with the fervor of holy war, their knights confident that they would drive the Muslims back across the Bosporus and reclaim the lands that had fallen beneath the crescent. The crusade marched toward Varna on the Black Sea coast, where Murad met them in a clash that would decide the fate of Europe's eastern frontier. The Ottoman advance was not inexorable. It was contested every step of the way by men who fought with the desperation of those defending their homelands. Still, Murad's persistence wore them down, and the Ottoman grip on the Balkans grew tighter with each passing year. In the midst of these struggles came a moment of unexpected drama. In 1444, weary of endless war, Murad abdicated his throne, retreating into seclusion and leaving the empire in the hands of his 12-year-old son, Mehmed. Perhaps he sought peace, perhaps he sought rest, but history is rarely gentle with those who step aside too soon. The boy sultan's inexperience invited intrigue, and enemies abroad sensed weakness. Byzantium, clinging to life behind its great walls, encouraged rebellion, while in Europe, Christian armies prepared once more to test the Ottomans. Murad was compelled to return. His brief retirement ended as he rode once more at the head of his armies, reclaiming the throne and restoring stability. When Murad the Coup breathed his last in 1451, the empire passed to his son, Mehmed, still young but already seasoned by the trials of his earlier brief reign. To many observers, he seemed an untested boy, a scholar more than a warrior, whose interests in philosophy, languages, and astronomy might dull the edge of his rule. Byzantium, clinging desperately to survival behind the ancient walls of Constantinople, dared to hope that this new sultan might lack the iron will of his father and grandfather. But beneath Mehmed's youthful face burned an ambition unlike any the Ottomans had known before. His eyes were fixed on one prize, a city that had stood for more than 1,000 years as the bastion of Christendom in the East, Constantinople. For centuries, the city had loomed as a symbol and a challenge. Surrounded by its triple walls, guarded by the sea on 3 sides, Constantinople had withstood sieges by Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and Crusaders. It was said that as long as its walls stood, the empire within would endure. But by the 15th century, Byzantium was but a shadow of its former glory. Its territories had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few outposts, and its emperors ruled more in ceremony than in power. Still, the city remained formidable, and its spiritual weight was immense. To conquer it would not only destroy Byzantium, but proclaim the Ottomans as heirs to Rome, masters of East and West. Mehmed prepared with relentless determination. He ordered the construction of a mighty fortress, Rumeli Hizara, on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly opposite the older Anadolu Hizara. Together, the two fortresses choked the straits, cutting Constantinople off from aid by sea. He assembled a vast army, drawn from across his domains, numbering perhaps 80,000 men. But his most fearsome weapon was not flesh and blood, it was iron. Mehmed commissioned giant cannons, cast by the Hungarian master Orban, capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds against the ancient walls. These monstrous guns, thunderous in their fury, were unlike anything the city had ever faced. In the spring of 1453, the Ottoman host encircled Constantinople. The city's emperor, Constantine the Vatsaukos Palaiologos, gathered his defenders, perhaps 7,000 strong, bolstered by a small contingent of Genoese under the commander Giovanni Giustiniani. They manned the walls with grim determination, aware that they were vastly outnumbered but resolved to fight to the last. Priests carried icons through the streets, processions prayed for deliverance, and in the Hagia Sophia, hymns rose in desperate hope. The siege began with thunder. Day and night, Mehmed's cannons pounded the walls, shaking the earth, toppling towers, and filling the air with smoke and dust. The defenders repaired the breaches as best they could, their hands bloodied and their bodies exhausted, but the relentless pounding never ceased. By sea, the Byzantines held hope in the great chain that barred the Golden Horn, a massive barrier that prevented Ottoman ships from entering the sheltered harbor. Yet Mehmed's ingenuity would not be thwarted. In one of the most daring feats of the siege, he ordered his ships dragged over land across greased logs and rolling platforms, from the Bosphorus into the Golden Horn itself. When dawn broke, the defenders beheld with horror the sight of Ottoman galleys floating behind their chain. Within the very waters they thought secure. The noose tightened. Weeks dragged into months, the city battered from every side. Still, Constantine and his people fought on, their courage immortalized in the chronicles of both friend and foe. But courage alone could not withstand destiny. In the early hours of May 29, 1453, Mehmed ordered the final assault. Wave after wave of soldiers crashed against the walls, first irregular troops, then Anatolian soldiers, and finally, the elite Janissaries, whose discipline and ferocity struck terror into all who opposed them. The defenders fought with desperation. Constantine himself is said to have cast aside his imperial robes, fighting as a soldier among his men until he vanished in the crush, his body never conclusively identified. Giustiniani fell wounded, his departure from the walls sowing despair among the defenders. Breaches widened under the relentless Ottoman assault, and at last, the city that had stood for more than a millennium was overrun. The Ottomans poured through the gates. Flags bearing the crescent were raised above the towers, and the echo of victory resounded across the straits. Mehmed rode into the city, now his city, and went straight to the Hagia Sophia. Once the greatest church of Christendom, it was now consecrated as a mosque, its vast dome echoing not with Byzantine hymns, but with the call to prayer. The transformation was complete. Constantinople had fallen, and with it, the last vestige of the Roman Empire. The world was stunned. In Europe, churches tolled their bells in mourning, kings and popes reeled at the news, and chronicles recorded the day as the end of an age. To the Ottomans, it was the dawn of a new era. Mehmed, still in his early 20s, had achieved what no conqueror before him had managed. He was thereafter known as Fatih, the conqueror. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became the new capital of the empire, its ancient walls now serving the heirs of Osman. With the conquest, Mehmed proclaimed himself not only Sultan, but Caesar, the successor of Rome. His empire straddled 2 continents, his armies unrivaled, his ambition unquenched. The tree of Osman, once a fragile sapling on the Anatolian frontier, now spread its branches across Europe and Asia. Its roots sunk deep into the soil of a city that had once claimed to be eternal. The fall of Constantinople was more than a military triumph. It was a civilizational turning point, a moment when the medieval world yielded to the modern. Trade routes shifted, scholars fled westward with manuscripts that would fuel the Renaissance, and the balance of power tilted irrevocably toward the Ottomans. Mehmed had done more than conquer a city. He had changed the course of history. But for the Ottomans, this was not an ending. It was a beginning. Constantinople, now Istanbul, became the heart of an empire that would rise to unmatched heights. Mehmed the Conqueror would go on to expand his dominion across the Balkans, into the Black Sea and across Anatolia, laying the foundations for centuries of supremacy. The world had witnessed the fall of an empire, but what rose in its place would be even more formidable. The crescent now stood where the cross had once reigned, and the age of Ottoman greatness had truly begun. The conquest of Constantinople had crowned Mehmed with immortal glory. Yet for the young sultan, it was not a culmination, but a beginning. With the city secured, he transformed it into the jewel of his empire. The ruins of war gave way to renewal, as artisans, scholars, and merchants were brought from across his dominions to repopulate and revitalize the ancient capital. Mosques rose beside churches, bustling markets filled the squares, and palaces proclaimed the grandeur of a new dynasty. Istanbul was no longer the last gasp of Byzantium. It was the living heart of a resurgent empire, a beacon of Ottoman ambition. From this seat of power, Mehmed looked outward. He saw not only the lands already under Ottoman dominion, but also those yet to be claimed, and his campaigns swept like tides across Europe and Asia. The Balkans, fractured and contested, lay foremost in his sights. Serbia, long a battleground between Ottomans and Hungarians, was finally subdued and absorbed into the empire. Bosnia fell next. Its mountains and valleys brought beneath the crescent, its Christian lords replaced by governors loyal to Istanbul. Albania resisted fiercely under the leadership of the indomitable Skanderbeg, who defied the Ottomans for decades with courage that earned him renown across Europe. Yet even there, Mehmed pressed relentlessly, and though Albania held for a time, the weight of empire eventually bore down. Northward, Mehmed tested the Hungarians, whose formidable leader, John Hunyadi, had once beaten back Ottoman advances. Though victories and defeats alternated, the balance of power tipped increasingly toward the Sultan. Across the Danube, fear grew that the flood of Ottoman armies would one day pour into the heart of Europe itself. Cities fortified, kings sought alliances, and papal envoys preached of crusade, but no force could halt Mehmed's determination. In the east, Anatolia demanded his attention. Rival Turkish beyliks still lingered, their independence a reminder of the Ottomans' frontier origins. Mehmed moved to extinguish these remnants, binding the peninsula more firmly under his rule. The Karamanids, long rivals of Osman's heirs, were subdued after bitter struggles. Step by step, the patchwork of Anatolian powers gave way to a single banner, the empire of the Sultan. Mehmed's vision extended beyond land alone. The sea, too, must bear his might. He ordered the strengthening of his navy, recognizing that the power to project force across the Mediterranean would secure not only conquest, but also commerce. The Black Sea, long a lifeline for Byzantine trade, was transformed into an Ottoman lake. Genoese colonies along its coasts, once proud outposts of Italian maritime wealth, fell one by one to the advancing fleet. The Crimean Khanate became an Ottoman ally, binding the northern shores to Istanbul's influence. In the Mediterranean, Mehmed's ambitions drew him into constant conflict with Venice, the most formidable maritime power of the age. For years, war raged between the Crescent and the Lion of St. Mark. Battles were fought on sea and land, Venetian galleys clashing with Ottoman ships across the Aegean, fortresses changing hands, islands falling under Ottoman control. Though Venice resisted with all the strength of its fleets and coffers, the balance shifted inexorably toward Mehmed. By the close of his reign, the Sultan had broken Venetian supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean, proving that the Ottomans were not only masters of land, but rising challengers of the sea. Nor were Mehmed's ambitions limited to his immediate neighbors. He dreamed of emulating Alexander the Great, of carrying his banners across Italy and into the heart of Christendom. In 1480, his armies landed at Otranto in southern Italy, seizing the city and planting the crescent on European soil far beyond the Balkans. The shock rippled across the continent. Rome itself trembled at the thought of an Ottoman advance into the peninsula, but fate intervened. The following year, Mehmed died suddenly, his great campaigns unfinished, his armies recalled. The invasion of Italy ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind both fear and the lingering memory of what might have been. In his death, Mehmed left an empire transformed. He had more than doubled its size, secured its capital, subdued its rivals, and announced to the world that the Ottomans were no longer a frontier principality, but a global power. His reign marked a decisive shift from survival to supremacy, from fragile statehood to imperial destiny. The name of Mehmed the Conqueror echoed across Europe and Asia, celebrated by his subjects, feared by his enemies, and remembered by history as the man who reshaped civilizations. Yet even in his triumphs, seeds of challenge were sown. His vast conquests demanded administration, his ambition stretched the limits of empire, and his successors would inherit not only glory, but also the burden of ruling a realm that now sprawled across 3 continents. The Ottomans had entered the stage of empires fully formed, and their next rulers would guide them into a golden age, unlike anything the world had seen. For on the horizon stood a figure who would eclipse even Mehmed in majesty, a sultan whose reign would stretch the empire to its greatest expanse, whose laws and armies would leave their mark upon the world. His name was Suleiman, called the Magnificent, and under his rule the empire of Osman would blaze with brilliance at the very height of its power. Generations had passed since the dream of Osman first stirred in the Anatolian hills, yet the tree he planted had grown into a forest whose canopy now stretched across continents. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was vast, its dominion spanning the shores of the Mediterranean, the plains of Hungary, the deserts of Arabia, and the coasts of Africa. But it was under the reign of Suleiman, the Magnificent, that the empire achieved a grandeur unparalleled in history, a synthesis of law, culture, and military power that would define an era. Suleiman ascended the throne in 1520, a young man of 26 inheriting a realm already formidable yet restless and expansive. His father, Selim the Fur, had carried the empire to its eastern limits, defeating the Safavids, conquering the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and extending Ottoman authority into Mesopotamia and Egypt. The young sultan inherited not only territory but also ambition, a vision of empire as a force that could govern, shape, and dominate on a scale previously unimagined. From the start, Suleiman demonstrated a mastery of both sword and state. His military campaigns were bold, precise, and relentless. In the west, he turned toward Europe, marching his armies into Hungary and confronting the Habsburgs. The siege of Belgrade in 1521 exemplified his genius. Formidable walls, centuries of defense, and thousands of defenders fell before his organized and disciplined forces, opening the Danube corridor to further Ottoman expansion. The conquest of Rhodes followed, where the Knights Hospitaller, defenders of Christendom, were expelled from the island that had long been a thorn in Ottoman maritime ambitions. Yet Suleiman was not merely a warrior. He was a master of law and governance, a ruler who understood that conquest alone could not sustain empire. Under his direction, the Ottoman legal system was codified, a comprehensive framework that blended Islamic law with practical regulations for taxation, trade, and civil administration. This legal architecture, known as the Qanun, provided stability across an empire of unparalleled diversity, uniting Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Slavs under a coherent system of governance. Suleiman's reforms ensured that while the Sultan wielded supreme power, his realm was ordered, predictable, and resilient, capable of enduring the strains of conquest and the complexities of administration. Culture flourished alongside the law and armies. Istanbul became the center of an intellectual and artistic renaissance. Mosques soared to the heavens, designed by Sinan, whose architectural genius rivaled the marvels of Constantinople itself. Palaces and gardens displayed imperial splendor, while poets, scholars, and scientists from across the empire gathered to enrich its intellectual life. Suleiman himself was a patron of the arts and letters, a poet who wrote under the pseudonym Muhibi, proving that power and refinement could coexist within the same ruler. The empire's reach during Suleiman's reign was staggering. To the north, his armies pressed into Hungary, threatening Vienna itself and challenging the Habsburgs. To the east, the Ottomans contended with the Safavids, a rival Islamic power, in brutal campaigns across Mesopotamia. To the south, the Mediterranean and Red Sea coasts were firmly under Ottoman control, and naval expeditions extended authority to the shores of North Africa. Every corner of the empire was touched by his hand, every province bound by the rhythm of law, taxation, and tribute. The battles, sieges, and campaigns were epic, legendary in their scope and intensity. At Mohacs in 1526, the Hungarian army was annihilated, opening the path to Buda and the heart of Central Europe. Suleiman's cavalry, disciplined infantry, and artillery corps combined to form one of the most formidable military machines of the era. And yet, even in conquest, Suleiman tempered victory with pragmatism. He incorporated local elites into governance, allowed religious minorities relative autonomy under the millet system, and nurtured loyalty through reward as much as through fear. Perhaps most remarkable was the way Suleiman balanced such immense power with vision. He understood that empire was not merely land and soldiers, but the minds, faiths, and lives of millions. Cities thrived under his rule. Trade routes flourished, scholarship and culture were encouraged, and the empire's subjects, whether Muslim or Christian, Jew or Greek, felt both the authority and the reach of his administration. In doing so, he created an empire whose strength was not only military but systemic, resilient, and adaptable. By the end of Suleiman's reign in 1566, the Ottoman Empire had achieved a zenith that would remain unmatched in its history. Its borders stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Nile Delta to the Caspian Sea. Its navy controlled the Mediterranean, its armies dominated the Balkans, and its capital, Istanbul, shone as a city of splendor, learning, and commerce. Suleiman himself became a symbol of imperial grandeur, law, and cultural achievement, revered by subjects and feared by rivals, remembered as the Magnificent, the ruler under whom the dream of Osman reached its apogee. Yet even as the empire glimmered in its power, the seeds of challenge were being sown. The complexities of administering such a vast and diverse domain, the ambitions of local governors, the pressures of European rivals, and the changing tides of trade and warfare would slowly test the empire's resilience. Suleiman's successors would inherit not only glory, but also the weight of maintaining an unprecedented structure, and the path from magnificence to decline, though centuries away, was already quietly taking shape. The age of Suleiman was an era of brilliance, a period in which the empire's power, culture, and reach were unmatched, and the legacy of Osman's dream was realized in its fullest form. Yet history's currents are relentless, and even the mightiest empires nourished by conquest and law must one day contend with the shifting winds of time. The story of the Ottoman Empire, triumphant yet mortal, was poised on the edge of a new chapter, an age in which both the grandeur and the vulnerabilities of a 6th-century dominion would be revealed. After the death of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1566, the Ottoman Empire entered an era defined not by conquest, but by consolidation, and slowly, by strain. Suleiman had left a realm of immense power, sprawling from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. Yet beneath its grandeur, the machinery of empire was beginning to groan under its own weight. The empire's size, which had been its greatest strength, now presented an unprecedented challenge. Governing millions across mountains, seas, and deserts, across languages, religions, and traditions, required a level of administrative dexterity that even the most capable sultans struggled to sustain. Suleiman's immediate successors inherited both glory and burden. Selim too, his son, lacked the military genius of his father and relied heavily on the counsel of his viziers. The central authority of the sultanate became increasingly mediated through the imperial bureaucracy, a system that had grown sophisticated under Suleiman, but was vulnerable to corruption, inefficiency, and factionalism. Provincial governors, once tightly controlled, began to assert greater independence. Revolts and local insurrections, though not yet existential threats, became more frequent, hinting at the underlying fragility of imperial cohesion. The empire's military, once the spear of expansion, began to show signs of stagnation. The elite Janissary corps, once composed of disciplined soldiers drawn from Christian youths converted and trained from an early age, gradually became a hereditary caste. Their martial edge dulled as privileges and political influence grew, and the same troops who had carried Ottoman banners to the walls of Vienna now resisted reforms and often meddled in palace politics. Meanwhile, European rivals adapted, modernizing their armies and fortifications. The once invincible Ottoman cannon and cavalry met stiffer resistance on both land and sea, and victories became harder to secure. On the frontiers, challenges mounted. In Europe, the Habsburgs and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth consolidated power, erecting fortresses and alliances to halt Ottoman advances. Naval power shifted as Portugal, Spain, and Venice asserted dominance over the Mediterranean, threatening Ottoman trade and supply lines. In the east, Safavid Persia remained a persistent rival, while the deserts of Arabia and the coastlines of North Africa tested the limits of Ottoman control. Each campaign demanded resources, attention, and careful management. Yet the empire increasingly struggled to sustain both its military campaigns and administrative oversight. Internally, social and economic strains began to emerge. Population growth and urbanization increased the demand for resources, while taxation policies and land tenure systems, designed for a different era, created tensions among peasants and provincial elites. Famine, disease, and inflation periodically struck, revealing the limits of central authority. Religious and ethnic diversity, which had been a source of Ottoman strength under Suleiman, became more challenging to manage as local identities pressed against imperial uniformity. The millet system, which allowed non-Muslims to govern their own affairs under Ottoman oversight, required careful balancing. Mismanagement could and did provoke unrest. Despite these challenges, the empire endured, remarkable for its ability to absorb shocks that might have destroyed lesser states. New sultans, viziers, and generals emerged to address crises, sometimes with brilliance, sometimes with failure. The empire adapted, often slowly, to changes in military technology, commerce, and diplomacy. Naval reforms, fortification programs, and strategic marriages preserved Ottoman influence in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Yet the momentum of conquest that had defined the age of Osman and Suleiman was gone. The empire's energy shifted inward, toward administration, defense, and survival. The 17th century brought both external and internal crises that tested the resilience of Ottoman power. Wars with Persia drained resources, while conflicts with Austria and Venice demanded constant vigilance. Uprisings in distant provinces, from Anatolia to the Balkans, revealed tensions between central authority and local ambitions. At the same time, the court itself became a theater of intrigue and factional struggle, as viziers, eunuchs, and princes competed for influence over the sultan. The empire's reputation for invincibility was gradually challenged, and the myth of Ottoman omnipotence cultivated for centuries began to fray. Yet even amid decline, Ottoman culture, law, and architecture flourished. Mosques, bridges, and palaces continued to rise. Scholarship, literature, and the arts thrived. Trade across the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and Red Sea linked Istanbul to the wider world. The empire retained its cohesion far longer than most contemporaries would have predicted, surviving military setbacks and administrative challenges that might have fractured lesser states. Its longevity was a testament to the foundational genius of its early rulers, from Osman through Suleiman, whose vision had created not only an empire of conquest but an enduring system capable of adaptation. By the 18th century, the signs of stagnation became more pronounced. Military defeats against Austria and Russia, the loss of peripheral territories, and internal corruption revealed that the empire's once unassailable position was eroding. The Ottomans increasingly found themselves reacting to European initiatives rather than setting their own agenda. Reform efforts were repeatedly attempted, with varying success. Yet the centrifugal forces of empire, ethnic, religious, economic, and political, continued to press against central authority. Through these centuries, the Ottoman Empire remained a colossus, feared and respected, yet increasingly aware that the tides of history were shifting. It was an empire that had survived calamities, civil wars, and the ambitions of rivals, yet it now faced the long, slow challenge of modernization in a world that had changed faster than the structures of its centuries-old state could always accommodate. The tree of Ottoman still spread its branches, magnificent and far-reaching, but its roots had begun to feel the strain of time, and the shadow of decline had begun to stretch across the empire's vast domains. The story of the Ottomans, once defined by unstoppable ascent, was now defined by endurance. Its survival into the 19th century, despite mounting internal and external pressures, reflected not only the genius of its founders, but the resilience of a system forged over 6 centuries. Yet history marches forward, indifferent to past glory. The centuries that followed would see the empire contending with revolutions, nationalism, foreign intervention, and the ultimate struggle to maintain relevance in a rapidly modernizing world. A struggle that would culminate in the dramatic final act of the Ottoman story in the early 20th century. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, once the unchallenged power of 3 continents, had become a shadow of its former glory. Europe had changed. Nations industrialized, armies modernized, and empires reshaped themselves in the fires of nationalism, commerce, and ideology. The Ottomans, bound by centuries-old traditions and administrative structures, struggled to keep pace. Internal weaknesses, corruption, inefficient bureaucracy, and a stagnant military were compounded by rising nationalist movements within the empire's diverse population. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Armenians, and Arabs began to demand autonomy or independence. Inspired by the ideas sweeping across Europe, wars became increasingly costly and humiliating. Russia, Austria, and later Britain and France seized upon Ottoman weakness to press territorial claims. The empire's once formidable navy could no longer dominate the Mediterranean, and its armies, though disciplined, were technologically outmatched by modern European forces. The loss of Egypt to Muhammad Ali of Egypt in the early 1800s was a shocking blow, a reminder that even the heartlands of Ottoman authority were vulnerable to internal rebellion and external ambition. The empire's leaders sought reform, initiating ambitious programs to modernize the military, administration, and education. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century attempted to centralize authority, codify laws, and integrate the empire's many peoples under a more uniform system of governance. Railways, telegraphs, and modern schools were introduced, and efforts were made to curtail the autonomy of provincial rulers. Yet these reforms were often uneven, resisted by conservative elements, and insufficient to fully meet the challenges of the modern world. Territorial losses mounted. Greece won its independence in 1830, and the Balkans slowly slipped from Ottoman control, piece by piece, as nationalist movements gained strength and European powers intervened to protect them. By the late 19th century, the empire had shrunk dramatically. Its European holdings reduced to little more than a corridor around Istanbul and parts of Macedonia, Albania, and Thrace. In Africa, Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt were increasingly under foreign influence or outright control. Even the fertile lands of Anatolia, once the empire's heart, faced administrative challenges, unrest, and economic strain. The early 20th century brought new calamities. The Balkan Wars of 1912–1913 stripped the empire of nearly all its European territories, leaving Istanbul and a few surrounding provinces as the empire's remaining foothold in Europe. World War I would prove the final crucible. The Ottoman state sided with the Central Powers, hoping to reclaim lost influence and protect its remaining territories. Battles from Gallipoli to Mesopotamia tested the empire's armies, but the tide of modern warfare and the empire's structural weaknesses proved insurmountable. By 1918, defeat was absolute. Allied forces occupied Constantinople and much of Anatolia, and the Ottoman state was left fractured, impoverished, and politically exhausted. Amid the ruins, a new vision emerged. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, rallied nationalist forces in Anatolia, rejecting foreign occupation and the continued monarchy. After years of struggle in the War of Independence, the modern Republic of Turkey was declared in 1923, with Ankara as its capital. The Sultanate was abolished, and the empire that had lasted over 6 centuries, surviving earthquakes, invasions, civil wars, and centuries of political intrigue, finally came to an official close. Yet even in its end, the Ottoman legacy endured. Its architecture, law, and institutions shaped the modern Middle East and the Balkans. Its cultural and artistic achievements, its sophisticated legal system, and its centuries of governance left an indelible mark. Istanbul, once Constantinople, remained a vibrant metropolis, a living reminder of a civilization that had connected continents, peoples, and faiths for more than half a millennium. The story of the Ottoman Empire is a story of rise and fall, of dreams forged on the Anatolian frontier and realized across 3 continents, from Osman's small principality to Suleiman's magnificent empire, from Mehmed's conquest of Constantinople to the struggles of the 19th century. The arc of history carried the empire through triumph and tragedy alike. It is a tale of ambition, vision, resilience, and adaptation, of power both fleeting and enduring. For 6 centuries, the Ottomans shaped the course of history, and though the empire itself has vanished, its influence continues to ripple across the modern world. The tree Osman planted so long ago took root, grew, bore fruit, and eventually withered. But its shadow, its legacy, and the story of its rise and fall remain immortal, echoing across the ages. A testament to what ambition, strategy, and vision can achieve. 6 centuries ago, in the rugged hills of Anatolia, a small principality was born under the name of Osman. What began as a humble frontier state, threatened by rivals on every side, grew into a force that would reshape continents. From Osman's first victories, through the disciplined campaigns of Orhan and Murad, the Ottomans pressed relentlessly into Europe and Anatolia, turning ambition into empire. Each conquest, each battle, was a step toward destiny. Kosovo, Nicopolis, Ankara, Constantinople, names that echo like thunder across the pages of history. The empire rose on the courage of warriors and the wisdom of rulers, yet it was more than armies and swords. It was a vision of governance, law, and culture that stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the Danube plains, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Suleiman the Magnificent embodied that vision at its apex, a sultan whose conquests, legislation, and patronage of the arts forged an empire both powerful and enduring. Cities flourished, scholars wrote, and bridges, mosques, and palaces testified to a civilization at its zenith. Yet as with all great powers, the empire faced the inexorable tides of change. Internal strains, bureaucratic inertia, nationalist uprisings, and the modernization of Europe chipped away at its strength. Wars were no longer easy victories. Provinces demanded attention, and the machinery of empire creaked under its own vastness. Still, the Ottomans endured, adapting, reforming, surviving centuries that would have destroyed lesser states. The final chapters were marked by struggle, loss, and transformation. By the early 20th century, the empire that once commanded continents had shrunk to Anatolia and Istanbul, its people weary from centuries of war and reform. World War I shattered what remained, but from the ruins arose a new nation. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk forged the Republic of Turkey, inheriting the land, the cities, and the spirit of Osman's legacy, while ushering the empire's story into history. The Ottoman Empire's tale is one of ambition and vision, of fire and patience, of triumph and tragedy. It is a story of men and women, soldiers and scholars, sultans and subjects who shaped a civilization that spanned centuries. Its rise reminds us of the power of courage and strategy, its fall of the limits of even the mightiest ambition. And though the empire no longer exists, its shadow endures, in the monuments of Istanbul, in the cultural tapestry of the Middle East and the Balkans, and in the memory of a world forever changed by its passage. From the small Anatolian hills where Osman first rode to the walls of Constantinople and the streets of Istanbul, from the campaigns of Mehmed the Conqueror to the golden age of Suleiman, the story of the Ottoman Empire is a reminder that history is shaped not just by destiny, but by vision, courage, and the enduring will to leave a mark upon the world. 600 years of power, ambition, and legacy, an empire born from a dream realized in conquest and remembered for eternity.